Photographic Composition, Lecture 3, Light, Part 2. Eugene Ache was a French photographer living in Paris who made it his mission to document the city from the middle of the 1890s up until his death in 1927. Most of his images are of the architecture and the streets, but also at times there were people in his photographs. In this case, it's a group of people looking at a solar eclipse. This is much more typical of Ache's work, however. His intention was to document the city as thoroughly as he possibly could. He would pay particular attention to buildings that were about to be torn down. He had people who would let him know that that was going to happen. He would go and record them. Very often, he would be the only photographer to have done that. He left behind about 10,000 images. Bernice Abbott rescued a lot of them. She had been working for Man Ray as an assistant and retrieved the images, and they now are in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Of particular interest in this image are some of the themes that Ache would concentrate on. How architecture is rendered in a photograph, but also the quality of the light. In this case, a particular note is the shadow of the tree on the wall on the right, as well as the light reflecting on the cobblestones down below. August Sander was a German photographer who made it his mission to document all of the types of people living in Germany between the turn of the century and up through the Second World War, or until the Second World War. This is an anomalous image. Most of his subjects were adults, but I like the whimsy of this. This is by Alexander Rodchenko, a Russian photographer who was constantly looking for different points of view, in this case, photographing down from, I believe it's a building. And here we see the shadows of people walking by, which look very three-dimensional, and their actual selves don't look, are almost invisible by comparison. This is by James Van der Zee, an African-American photographer who had a studio in Harlem and documented the people of Harlem for many, many years. In this case, a couple and their car. Bernice Abbott, as I mentioned, rescued a lot of Eugene Ache's work, was also a great photographer in her own right, an American. This is a cityscape taken from one of the upper floors of the Chrysler building in New York. Walker Evans was a photographer who worked for the Farm Security Administration during the Depression, and his focus was largely on rural architecture. He also photographed people, but architecture is what he's best known for. He would often wait for hours for the light to be just right. He would not be rushed. And as a result, we have a lot of extraordinary photographs. He really invented, I think in many ways, the American way of seeing things in photographs. He also embarked on a series of people in subways in New York, of which this is one. He was using a camera that was concealed, and an interesting sense of the light in the foreground, but also the city in the background. Dorothea Lange was also a Farm Security Administration photographer. This is Migrant Mother, and one of the best known images to come out of the Depression. It's interesting to see some of the other images that were made leading up to it, or at least at the same time. On the right, the large one though is the one that became really well known. Albert Ronger Patch was a German photographer and interested in architecture and industrial imagery, but also in nature. In this case, I think this is an extraordinary image of a forest where we see, as we've seen in other images, where the foreground elements are much darker than the background elements, leading the viewer out into what looks like the void. Henri Cartier-Bresson was a French photographer who documented the world. I mean, he went to all parts of the world to make photographs. And his credo was something he referred to as the decisive moment, which he said that there was a very specific moment when the photographer and what was happening in front of him or her came together, and that was the time that it made the most sense to take the picture. In this case, it certainly makes sense. And if this child had not been where she was at the time of this exposure, it would be a very different image, even though she's so small in the frame. In this instance, also by Cartier-Bresson, it's an overcast day, and as a result, we have this wonderful silhouette of one of the islands in the Seine and the bridges that connect it to the left and right banks. Margaret Bourke-White was an American photojournalist who covered a wide range of subject matter. This, I believe, is Dresden, but I may be wrong about that, after it had been bombed, but with particular attention paid to people who had been dispossessed, as you can see in the lower left. Lee Miller had been an assistant to Man Ray Ault, as well as had Bernice Abbott, but she had been, before that, she was a model and an actress, and but also a photographer in her own right. Much more interested in the world as she saw it than in recording fashion or anything light like that. This is by Bill Claxton, whose specialty was jazz. This is Ella Fitzgerald singing for Duke Ellington, among others, and with extraordinary light. It looks like there was spotlight on Fitzgerald, but there's also this wonderful lighting on Ellington. This is by W. Eugene Smith, who was one of the great photo essayists who worked primarily for Life magazine. This is of a mother bathing her son who had been born with birth defects due to mercury poisoning. The light coming in from the back is quite extraordinary, though. A very rich image of what must be very painful. Gordon Parks was also an African-American photographer, and although he made a name for himself photographing celebrities and fashion and worked for Life magazine and others, he was also interested in the African-American experience, and in this case, putting people who lived and worked in the community where they lived and worked. In this case, somebody who actually worked in the sewers. Reuter Caryville was another African-American photographer who was particularly interested in the black, various shades of black, which would seem antithetical to image making, but in his hands that wasn't the case at all. I mean, this is a very loaded image, I believe, even though you can't see a lot of detail. It's mysterious, and at the same time, it really does convey what's going on. It's a couple dancing, and we don't need to see their faces to have a sense of what's going on with them. This is by Minor White, who was particularly interested in the effects that light had in his photographs. In this case, a reflection cast in a wall, a window frame, and drapes, and make for a very kind of oddly poetic composition. Robert Frank was a Swiss photographer, is a Swiss photographer, who came to the United States after the Second World War and created a body of work called The Americans, which were assembled into a book, which was a landmark creation. He was interested in the landscape, but also in the people of the United States, his adopted country. His pictures were reviled by the established photography aficionados of the day as being unfinished and badly made, but with a lot of his images, that's exactly the point. There's a rawness to them that's much more emotionally immediate than a lot of other photography. This is by Vivian Maier, who was just recently discovered, who had been taking photographs from the 50s on and was completely unknown until recently, until after she died. Her images have now surfaced, but I think quite an extraordinary photographer working primarily in Chicago. Richard Avedon was probably the best known fashion photographer of his day from the end of the Second World War through the rest of the century. And he brought a real sense of animation and life to fashion photography in ways that it hadn't appeared before. Using very simple techniques as far as lighting is concerned, usually only one or maybe a couple of lights, but one primary light and then maybe something else to fill a little bit. But he would keep it really simple, and the imagery is just, I think, stunningly powerful. Irving Penn was a contemporary of Avedon's and photographed people in fashion and product and other objects. Celebrities certainly were among them. This picture of Pablo Picasso, again, extraordinary lighting, very simple, probably only the one source of light, but the image is absolutely striking. This is a still life by Penn, showing a very different side of him, and with the intent of revealing the lacy quality of this particular flower. It looks like a poppy. This is by Bert Stern, who was an advertising photographer, and at a very early age made this particular image, which kind of put him on the map. He took a glass of Smirnoff vodka and put it in front of one of the pyramids in Egypt and showed the optical phenomenon that occurs when looking through glass or water, in this case, where the image is actually inverted, which is what happens to us in our optical in our eyes. Stern was also a photographer of people, photographed Marilyn Monroe many times, and I think this is a particularly interesting image. She looks really as if she'd been taken unawares, and she looks very vulnerable. This is by Bob Willoughby, who was a set photographer. He would work on films doing stills, and the light being cast through this curtain, I think, is quite extraordinary and quite beautiful on Elizabeth Taylor.